We have here today a very special guest, and he is Ralph Enlow, Dr. Ralph Enlow. And Ralph served as the president of ABHE most recently, and he has become a dear personal friend to me, but also a friend of ISET. He's a senior advisor, so he serves with us at the board level with ISET and does a number of other things for us. But he's also helped ISET over the last few years in helping us to better have ourselves be structured, board governance and things like that. And so we couldn't think of a better person to join us today to speak on that topic. So Ralph, thank you for taking your time and energy and effort to be with us today. And we all look forward to hearing what you have to say about board governance. And it's an important topic to many of us. So welcome and glad you're with us today, Ralph.
And I give you my heartiest greetings in the Lord Jesus Christ. As my friend Ralph Neighbor used to say, the Christ who lives in me greets the Christ who lives in you. I see among those who are in attendance people that are dearly beloved to me. It's great to see you today. Uh, I have a lot to say this morning, and let me emphasize that these materials will be available to you after the session. So I'm going to go fairly quickly. There was a story about a speaker that got up in front of the audience and said, I have so much to say, I don't even know where to begin. And a little boy in the audience said, well, how about somewhere near the end? Well, I'm going to start at the beginning and we'll see how far we get. And I am planning to leave time for questions and answers. Michael will host us in a time of discussion. So I'll move as quickly as I can. Let's go. Now my slides are not advancing. Let's see if I can advance them. Yeah, there we go. I start with this statement, and it's not original with me, but I heartily agree with it. Organizations are built from the bottom up, but they fall apart from the top down. Almost every time I've encountered an organization that's struggling, that's not thriving, among the key issues in that organization are the governing board. And so I believe very strongly in strong governing boards, and I want to help you today. Our goal today is to basically three things. I want to give you some language that you can use that might be useful in the realm of board governance to get a little bit of a level set for yourself about where you are and where your board is regarding these key concepts and help you think about learning priorities and a plan for improvement for your board. I want to acknowledge right from the beginning that there are a lot of contextual differences. When I speak about a governing board, I'm primarily thinking about my North American context and all of the legal frameworks involved in governing boards here. You may have to make adjustments to your own context. And so I apologize that I have to be generalizing today, but I hope that some of the principles will be recognized to be very transferable for you. And certainly as we begin with biblical principles, I hope you see the universality of those principles. The first thing to say about board members or governing board members is that I think a more useful term to board members is, even though legally a lot of us might use a term like board of directors, that spiritually speaking, we're talking about stewardship. We're talking about trustees, people who have been entrusted with a ministry, with a work that God has planted, and we're merely stewards. We're not owners, and we're not directors in that sense. One of the three primary metaphors for leadership in the Bible is the metaphor of steward. And this is the places in the Bible where the word servant is matched up with the concept of a person who is the servant of the Lord, a person who's accountable to the Lord for the role to which they've been assigned, and a person who is responsible for God, for what God owns. We don't own our organizations. God owns them. We're stewards. We're accountable to him and we're responsible. So I like to say it this way: a steward is somebody who's not entitled to privileges of an office for their own benefit, but rather is entrusted with performing an obligation for the master's benefit. That's what a biblical concept of stewardship is. In the secular realm, being a board member might suggest that somebody has authority over the organization and accountability to the stakeholders of the organization and to the society. But I think a better way to think about board governance in our framework is that our authority is under our God, and our primary accountability is to Him, and secondarily to the stakeholders of the organization and to the state or to the nation, the national government, whatever governmental entity that is to which we're answerable. Uh, Second Timothy, Paul exhorts Timothy, by the Holy Spirit who dwells within us, guard the good deposit entrusted to you. I think that's the essence of board governance. You're a steward who's entrusted with something by the living God. And so we're not people who lord it over other people and over our organizations. We don't rule from an exalted state, but we simply operate as biblical stewards. It's a sacred trust. And I want to go on to say that it's a shared trust. And by that, I mean this: the word board is a collective noun. There's no such thing as an individual who's a board, who has any intrinsic individual authority. The only authority of the board is collective authority. So no individual board member has authority. There's no hierarchy within the board. There's no seniority within the board. Collectively, we act as one, and we act together as one mind and one heart. And the only activity that we have is when we're gathered as a group to act on behalf of our organization. Otherwise, outside of our gatherings, none of us has any individual authority other than what derives from the board's designation of us. For example, if I'm the board chair, my chair is not, my role is not intrinsic authority, it's derived from the authority of the board, and it's delegated by the board. So the authority that I have is limited to what the board delegates me to have. And that would be true of any other officer on the board or anybody who's acting on behalf of the board. The authority comes from the board. It's delegated to me, not the other way around. I don't rule the board rules me, I guess is a way to say it. So there's no individual authority over the organization. I can't walk into the business office and say, I'm here as a trustee and I'm telling you what to do. That's not the way boards work. Their authority is collective, and it's the only authority of any board member is what's been delegated to them by the board. They don't carry that authority outside of the board meeting itself. And the primary function of the board chair is not so much to exercise authority over the board, but to take responsibility for the board's culture and to manage the board's process. So the board chair's role is to serve the board, not to make the board serve him or her. These are general principles that are true even of secular boards, but they're especially true of boards of ministry organizations, I believe. Every board member then wears one of three hats, if you will. If you're a member of a board, you wear one of three hats. You wear the hat of governor, that is, you actually are carrying out the role of governor, but that's only when the board is in session. You're only carrying out the function of governance when you're meeting together with other members of the board, and your authority there is plural. It's board members that are governors. You're only wearing that hat when you're in a board meeting. Outside of a board meeting, you may be called upon to give advice based on your experience and expertise. And in that case, you're wearing your advisory hat. You're not wearing your director hat or your governor hat. So you're not telling people what to do, you're giving them advice that they've solicited from you that's based on your wisdom and experience and expertise. Or thirdly, you might be wearing the volunteer hat. So as a member of the board, you might be asked to help out in the academic dean's office. But in that case, your authority is not over the academic dean's office, it's under the academic dean's office because you're a volunteer in that context. So it's important for boards to have this language and to recognize and to frankly exhort and challenge each other to be careful that they are conscious of what hat they're wearing as a board member, whether governor or advisor or volunteer. I think those distinctions are important and they really help board members to regulate their conduct in ways that are most constructive and most conforming to biblical standards and to good practice. One of the most insightful people that talks about nonprofit board governance is a man named John Carver. Some of you that have worked in board governance have probably encountered this man's name. He wrote a book called Boards That Make a Difference. And a lot of his wisdom is used in various spheres regarding board governance. And John Carver identifies 5 common flaws in board governance. And they're on the screen there in front of you. Many boards, you might even say most boards, run into these problems. Too much time on trivia. In other words, they spend too much time on things that are of little importance and they neglect things that are more important. Secondly, they have a short-term bias. They don't think long-term. They get obsessed with things that are in the immediate need, but they forget about the long-term vision and planning of the organization. Third, they're reactive. In other words, they deal with what comes to them rather than taking initiative and being proactive about the potential and the future of the organization. They're reactive. Fourth, they have leaky accountability. In other words, they make a decision, but it's not clear who's responsible to follow through on the decision, and they don't follow up on decisions they make. And so things that they thought they have taken care of and have decided never get done. They don't get followed up on. And then finally, ambiguous authority. That is, it's not clear who's supposed to do what. And so these are flaws that are very common in board governance. Maybe you recognize some of these flaws in the work of your own institution. They tend to prevail and be manifest. My own view is about 80% of nonprofit boards are pretty ineffective. Maybe about 15% are moderately effective, and maybe only about 5% of nonprofit boards are really effective. So we have a lot of work to do in nonprofit governance. Maybe you can relate to these flaws in terms of your own organization. Well, Carver not only identifies flaws, but then in response to those flaws, he suggests 4 big things that boards need to understand and boards need to do in order to correct these flaws. And he speaks about these 4 as ends orientation, executive limitations, board CEO. I'm using the term CEO here. You may mean rector or president or whatever other term is appropriate for your organization. CEO is obviously a common American designation, but it wouldn't translate in your context in many cases. But board, executive relations, and then board process. Good boards make real progress on these big 4 issues: ends orientation, executive limitations, board CEO relations, and board process. So let's talk first about ends orientation. What I mean here is to ask ourselves the question, how much of our board time is really devoted to means rather than ends? Do we just talk about how we get things done? Things like where we spend our money, what the budget is, all these kinds of things. Or are we really talking about ends? Are we talking about mission, values, and vision? I've got this chart for you, which I don't have time to unpack. I leave it for you in the slide deck for you to think about. But boards need to be primarily engaged with matters of mission, values, and vision. They need to be talking about ends a lot more than they talk about means. That means to the end are the responsibility of administration. The ends are the responsibility of the governing board. And good boards make a distinction between ends and means, and they focus on ends and leave the means to the administration. Peter Drucker is another management guru, and he suggests that uh, good leadership, good organizational leadership, really revolves around 5 questions. What is our mission? Who is the customer? And if you don't like that word, that sounds too crass and commercial to you, you could say, who is the beneficiary? Who's the beneficiary? Who's the target? Who's the one that benefits from our mission? So what's our mission? Who's the beneficiary? What does the beneficiary value? What's our plan? And what are the results? Those are questions that boards need to be occupied with. Those are ends questions, not merely means questions. And good boards focus on those questions. There are 3 domains of activity for boards. And there's an article here. I've cited the source, Chait, Ryan, and Taylor. And I think you can probably recognize by what's on the screen that the vast majority of boards focus on that first category, fiduciary. In other words, they focus on the stewardship of resources and the management aspects of the organization, personnel matters, facility matters, resource matters, but they spend too little time on strategy and real out of the box thinking, I guess you would say. So strategic means what are the issues that are challenging our organization? What exists outside of our organization that we need to be paying attention to? What environment are we operating in? What are the strengths and weaknesses? And particularly, what are the opportunities that are before us? And then generative leadership on the part of a board is to say, what if? What if we're really thinking about this whole question wrongly? Should we reimagine what we're doing? So, for example, let's talk about ISET, for example. Historically, ISET has thought of itself as an organization comprised of theological schools. We've focused on theological institutions, brick and mortar institutions, but we realized that theological education is not the global need for theological training, for ministry leadership training, is not going to be solved by schools. We're going to have to think outside the box of institutional education. We're going to have to rethink. We're going to have to be generative. What if we could think about what our job is in a different way? That's what I mean by generative. And again, I would argue that the vast majority of boards spend almost all their time thinking about fiduciary issues, and they never get to strategic or generative thinking. So I think these categories are useful in terms of thinking about the board's responsibility to be focused on ends primarily rather than simply means. So how much of the board time is devoted to means rather than ends? That's probably something that you need to reflect on after every board, well, as you put the agenda together for every board meeting, and then after every board meeting, this is a good question to ask yourself. And then a way to implement that ends versus means discipline is to ask yourself the question, are most of our decisions policy decisions? In other words, we've been presented with a problem. How do we solve this problem? Do we solve it only by, let me go back here, do we solve it only by dealing with that specific issue, or do we think could we develop a policy that helps us know how to deal with this issue more efficiently in the future so we don't have to keep coming back to this issue over and over again? That's what I mean about policy decisions. So again, agenda item questions, as we're putting together the agenda or as we're going through the agenda in a meeting, these questions are very helpful. First of all, the question we need to ask, is this really board business, or did the administration just bring it to us because they think we need to be talking about this? Should we just say to the administration, no, you guys go work on that? That's not our business. Our business is to talk about ends, not means. Thank you for bringing it to us. That's nice, but we really shouldn't be wasting our time talking about that. That's why we hired you to be the administration. You need to deal with the means. We need to deal with the ends. So that's a good question to ask when you're putting together agenda, and again, after a meeting, to ask, how much of our board meeting was really board business versus administrative business? And then when an issue is brought to us, a good way to frame that issue is, how should we address this matter so that our focus is primarily on issues of governance? In other words, on ends rather than means. So there are ways to discuss an issue in which we get way down into the weeds about how to solve a problem rather than thinking at the policy level about how to make sure that that problem doesn't keep coming back to us, because we now have a policy that governs that particular area. So ends rather than means are the board's business. How much of our board time is devoted to means rather than ends? Are most of our decisions policy decisions? And do we have a written agreement on what scores a goal? In other words, how do we know that the organization is really achieving its goals? Do we have a written understanding of how we're going to assess the success of our organization? Those are board matters that we need to stay focused on as boards. So Carver's Big Four solutions to the flaws of governance are, first of all, ends orientation. Secondly, executive limitations. Let's talk about that briefly. The main thing to say here is, when we write policies, do we write them primarily as permission for administration, or do we write them in terms of proscription? That's probably a word that you don't know, but the idea is, write a policy in terms of what the administration cannot do rather than in terms of what the administration is permitted to do. For example, the administration cannot present to you a budget that plans for a deficit. That's a good budget policy. They cannot present you a budget that plans for a deficit. Or the president cannot do this particular thing. The president can't make this decision. So what you're saying then is, here's a box that we're drawing around the prerogatives of the administration. Here's the mission of the organization, and the administration is free to do whatever is prudent in pursuing the mission of the organization, except that it can't go outside that box that we've drawn by policy. So we write policies by proscription rather than permission. So the administration doesn't have to keep coming to us for permission to do things, because there's a mutual understanding of what's forbidden, and everything else that is missionally aligned then is permitted within the structures of accountability. So policies differentiate between relatively permanent, values-oriented parameters of the board and delegated administrative discretion. That's the way we build policies in the board. And then thirdly, Carver's Big Four deals with board, president, or rector, or whatever you want to call it, relations. And there we talk about, are we clear about what constitutes our chief executive's effectiveness? As a board, do we have a clear understanding of how we know if the chief executive is being effective in their role? If we're ambiguous about that, no wonder the organization is not going to be effective. We need to understand that basically the effectiveness of the chief executive and the effectiveness of the organization are synonymous. If the chief executive is not effective, then the organization is not effective, and vice versa. If the organization is not achieving its goals, then at some level, whoever's in charge is not effective. Some corrective action needs to be taken. So, moving on, um, are we agreed about how we're going to assess key result areas? Again, every board needs to have an understanding of what are key result areas that we expect for the president and the organization to achieve. And we need to have agreement about how we're going to assess that. How are we going to keep score as an organization? Do we have a scorecard that everybody agrees on? Really, boards are only responsible. You could boil down all board responsibility to two things, in my judgment. Two words. And if you don't remember anything else from today, I would say remember that boards have two big responsibilities: sustainability and success. What's a board responsible for? Sustainability and success. What do I mean by sustainability? First of all, good boards have sustainable governing boards. In other words, the boards themselves are sustainable. They're strong, they have good processes. Board members have continuity, but also there's planning for the future and changeover and renewal on the board. The board structures are strong. The board members are well oriented. They're well selected. They're missionally aligned with the organization. They have good governance. Sustainable organizations have sustainable financial resources. So again, there's a long-term strategic vision about the sustainability of the organization and the business model that's required to sustain the organization. The board is responsible for not just this year's budget, but for long-term sustainability. And obviously that includes human resources. Do we have human resources that are missionally aligned and are sustainable? If we're losing a lot of people, boards should be alarmed because the organization's sustainability is threatened. And then boards need to be very attentive to risk. What are the external threats to the organization that create great risk for the sustainability of the organization? These are matters that boards need to be particularly attentive to. So, two things that the boards are responsible for. If you want to boil it down to two big things: sustainability, number one, in terms of governance, financial resources, human resources, and risk mitigation, and then success. And what I would say here is we need to make sure that success is defined in terms of the organization's mission, not primarily in terms of imitation of other organizations like ours. The secular standards of success in our work are not necessarily the best ways to measure success for our organization. We should measure success for our organization in terms of what God has called us to do, not in terms primarily of comparison to how we're doing relative to other organizations. So success, again, goes back to this question: do we have agreement on what looks like success, on what scores are run, on what the key result areas are? So are we clear about the executive's job product? Are we agreed about how we'll assess key result areas? And do we grant executive discretion regarding the means of how to get there because we have good policies that define our parameters? Finally, I want to just mention board process. Great boards are intentional about making the board stronger and better. Great boards are not passive about the condition of the board itself. And there are three things that might be useful as you think about this. Do we have written policies governing the board's composition, culture, and conduct? Do we have a board policy manual that governs how the board is going to be composed, what its culture is going to be like, what is good and bad behavior on the board, We enforce that conduct among board members, and that includes attendance and participation. It includes the way we handle disagreement and those kinds of things. Do we have written policies about that? Secondly, do we have a plan to optimize board composition and continuity? Are we growing our board in line with our mission? And are we making sure that there's continuity on the board so that the board doesn't keep turning over? Are the terms of our board members too short or too long? And then third, is there a board committee responsible that's looking at this issue and is taking care? A lot of boards call this a governance committee or a nominating and review committee. Is there a board committee that's specifically responsible to assess and improve board governance? One matter about board composition that I'll just mention to you briefly. Some people suggest that there are four components that need to be on any good board. Any good board needs to be built of four components. You need to have at least some board members whose primary contribution to the work of the board is their wisdom. And that is specifically their wisdom relative to the work of your organization. So you need to have, if you're an educational institution, you need to have some people on your board who know a lot about education. And you probably need some people on your board that know something about legal issues, or you need somebody on your board who knows something about risk or about finances. They bring wisdom to the board in particular areas that the board needs. Secondly, you need people on the board who have wealth or have a connection to wealth who can help grow the capacity of your organization financially and grow the sustainability of your organization financially. There need to be people on the board who can connect you to the resources God has to help your organization be sustainable. So, thirdly, you need people on the board who can do something on behalf of the organization. They have time to volunteer for you, and they can serve you in some specific way that would be helpful to the organization. And the final aspect that board members might bring would be what's called witness. And that is, these are people by whose visibility and credibility they enhance your organization's visibility and credibility among your stakeholders. And every good board member should bring at least one of those things to their board service. Each board member won't bring every one of those four things, but every one of your board members should bring at least one of those things, and your board should be balanced in terms of the representation of those board contributions if your board composition is going to be strong. So wisdom, wealth, work, and witness are four key factors in good governance. Here, performance keys, trust and candor, the fostering of open dissent. If all your decisions are unanimous, or if there's no voicing of opposition or dissent, that's not a healthy board. There needs to be a tension between unanimity and healthy dissent. And there needs to be a climate of trust and candor. And board roles need to be fluid to some extent. They need to move around. Individual board members need to be held accountable. So if board members are misbehaving or if they're not attending regularly, there need to be consequences, including dismissal from the board. And then there needs to be regular evaluation of board performance. So there you have it. I just laid out three things for you today, gave you some language to work with in terms of board governance, maybe an opportunity for you to do a level set in terms of your own organization. And then thirdly, for you to think about what are the learning priorities and plan for your organization relative to board governance. I remind you again that organizations are built from the bottom up, but they fall apart from the top down. We now have some time for questions and discussion, and I'm going to turn it over to my brother Michael. All yours, brother.
Thank you, Ralph. As usual, you have a great presentation, lots of things to think about, and really appreciated your comment about the stewardship issue, right? And making sure
Yeah.
we are clear that we don't own our organizations. We are here temporarily caring for them on behalf of our Lord and God. So thank you for that reminder as well. We have time now for some questions, maybe comments that people might have, and Ralph is available here now to address any thoughts that anyone might have. So I'm going to open it up for questions and comments. Well, Ralph, I'll throw one in there then. Oh, Stephen Kemp has his hand up. There you
Oh,
go.
hi, Steve.
Okay, there we
Hey,
go.
Ralph.
We go back a long way, Steve and I.
Yes.
Yeah.
Don't start telling stories.
No, I won't. It's mutually assured destruction. Yeah. Yeah.
I appreciated your mentioning of the two areas of attention, sustainability and success. My experience has been that young organizations are able to manage that tension better than old organizations. And
Mm,
older organizations tend to let sustainability actually kind of sometimes quench success or even innovation towards success. I wonder if
yeah.
you would comment on how you keep those two intact.
Yeah. Yeah. So older organizations sort of want to just preserve their existence and not really understand what the achievement of their mission would be, if I understand that's your question, Steve. And my friend Steve Moore says that Christian organizations can be like zombies. They can get scary, ugly, but it's hard to kill them. Um, and I think that's true of a lot of Christian organizations. So I think all good boards, no matter how old and frankly how sustainable the organization looks in terms of its assets and its business model and so on, continues to need to ask its question: how do we know we're really achieving our mission? And do we have real agreement on what that looks like? Yeah, I think your observation that's a great observation. I don't know that I've thought about that before, Steve.
Great. Good question, Steve. Others?
Do I see one in the chat there? I can't tell.
Yeah, I'm looking at that too. I want to see.
Um, Question?
Yeah, Elias.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. Very helpful and insightful.
Hello there,
Um,
my brother. Praying for Lebanon.
Thank you. Thank you. It's appreciate the parents. Thank you for your presentations. Very informative. Um, um, I found it striking that stat you gave about the percentage of nonprofit the board about 85% ineffective. I wonder why that is. From sort of a Christian perspective, considering how, the part of our understanding that this is, we have the ethos of stewardship and faithfulness built into our faith. And then the second question related to that, highly appreciate what you're presenting. I find that if I'm trying to sort of recruit members into the board, is this kind of training what you presented? Is this something that you share with people before nominating them to be board members, or is this something that you have to, once they're in, this is, you start explaining this, like practically how would you go about rolling that out?
Yeah. Couple things to say. First of all, this 80-15-5 ratio that I gave you is my own observation. So it's not a researched thing, except I would say it very much resonates with Carver's analysis that the vast majority of nonprofit boards are characterized by those five flaws that he mentioned. Um, and I find this everywhere I go. And I think part of the reason is that board members, even board members in Christian organizations, see their appointment to a board kind of as a status thing. And they also can be fairly passive in terms of just walking into the culture and habits of a board and not really thinking about what governance is. Now, back to your question of how do boards get out of this, they become intentional about board development. And that begins with the selection and orientation of board members. So at some level, board selection and orientation needs to be informed by everything that I said today. And so you start building a board culture of board members that really understand what governance really involves. And and the good news is I've been involved directly with boards who made this transition. I was on a large mission agency board for a number of years. When I went there, this was a $100 million global operation. Every $100 million a year, they didn't have a budget. They would literally, in a board meeting, be deciding whether they would give permission to the international director to take a trip to South Africa for $6,000. What a waste of board time and stewardship. But they were in the habit of doing things that way. And they had board members that had been on the board 30 years that had never done a thing. Well, it took 10 years to change the structure of the board, the composition of the board, the habits of the board, the knowledge of the board, the orientation of the board. But it happened. And we ended up having a very efficient board. It can be done.
Great. Thank you, Ralph. We
Sure.
have a couple of other hands that have come up there. Freyo, welcome, my friend. Good to have you on the call with us. And looks like you have a question for Ralph.
Hello, my brother, former student. Good to see you, brother.
Yes, Dr. Ralph, good to see you. Well, thank you for your presentation. And so I like the four W's on the contribution of board members. So the idea of wisdom, wealth, and work and witness. And my question is, in nonprofit organizations, do we need to remunerate? Do we need to pay to compensate board members?
In my context, that would be illegal. You can't, if it's a nonprofit board, board members cannot be financially compensated. And my own view is that healthier boards have people on the board that are volunteers. They don't profit from their board role. There might be other rewards and incentives that you can provide for board members, but compensation is not one that's even legal in my country. I don't know how it works in your country.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. And we also have Victor has his hand up, and welcome, Victor. Good to have you with us. And you want to ask a question?
Hello, Victor.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ralph. That was very profound and very eye-opener.
My pleasure, brother.
Yeah, thank you. I love the aspect of sustainability. Yeah, I really want to ask about this. The role between the founder and the board of trustees is a major concern in my context, where the founder wants everything to go his way, what he wants, and so he hires and then he fires. Now, if for instance, I'm a member of the board, and then with my training, I know that the aspect of sustainability is very key.
Yeah.
And then I'm protecting something that could help, and the founder is listening. So what should be my response? What should I do? Do I continue to remain in the board or what?
Yeah, that's a very sticky question. And again, I don't know your context well enough, but you're saying, if I understand you correctly, you may have one person on the board who's really the big funder and who's acting like they have a disproportionate amount of authority over what what happens to the organization. In my own experience, this goes back to the 1960s. I was still a student at the time at Columbia, where I served for many years. And Columbia had one board member who basically was the funder of the school. He was extremely wealthy, and he became even more wealthy because he sold his company. And so he was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. and the indebtedness of the school was equal to its annual budget. And he made a deal with the president that he would pay, that if he sold his company, which he did, he would pay off the school's debt if, in fact, we would make an agreement that we would never go into debt again, which was a good thing. Later, he became one of several board members that gave an ultimatum to the president to say, if you don't do what we think you should do, we're going to withdraw from the board. And believe it or not, the rest of the board had the courage to say, see ya. We're not going to be held hostage. And it was a very courageous and risky thing for them to do. The Lord validated that decision, and the organization was sustained. And interestingly, this brother was reconciled to the organization. At some point, it becomes an integrity test. Are we going to be held hostage to somebody who has the purse strings, or are we going to step out in faith and trust the Lord? I don't know enough about your situation to know. I think I would begin with board training and orientation and just say board is a collective now. No individual has authority or hierarchy over everybody else, and see how the person responds.
That's a tough one, isn't it, Ralph? Wow.
Yeah. And I'm sure that in some ways that's more common in some parts of the world than it is even in North America. But
Right.
it's true in North America sometimes
Right.
too.
Right. Absolutely. There's a question in the chat from Lindsay. I'll read it here. She says, let me see here. Assuming we can define success as faithfulness to the mission to which God has called us, how can we change the negative perceptions around this term, especially given the way it's
Ah,
often abused in so
yeah.
many in so-called prosperity teaching in some
Ah,
Christian
yeah.
circles. So he's asking this kind of question about really revolving around the term success and how we use that in
Yeah.
prosperity. What are your thoughts on that, Ralph?
Yeah. I think again, what we tend to do is to say, oh, um, you know, like in North America, let me just give you the example in North America. We say, okay, we're a higher educational institution, we're a college or, whatever. Well, what's the most successful institution in North America? Well, Harvard. Well, how do we know Harvard's successful? Because their graduates go into all kinds of places of influence and they make all this money and they have all these intellectual achievements and they go to the best doctoral programs and so on. That's how we know we're successful. And we have a huge endowment and we have a huge library and our faculty has very impressive academic credentials. So, how do we know we're a successful institution? The more that we have these attributes of Harvard, we must be successful. Instead of asking ourselves, what would it take to convince us that we're actually achieving our mission? And that's an open-ended question for a board and say, how would we know if we're achieving our mission? I'm working with an organization right now that's experiencing strong enrollment growth. And I'm challenging the board to say, what does that have to do with success? I mean, enrollment growth's nice. I mean, but that doesn't tell me we're successful because you can grow enrollment and by bringing in students who are not aligned with your mission. And you're actually eroding the achievement of your mission by bringing in the wrong kind of students.
Yeah.
And so we tout ourselves. We had a 10% increase in enrollment. Yeah, but what kind of students? So a better way to define success for that situation is say, what's a mission quality student look like in our organization? Have we defined what an ideal student would look like? And by the way, in building that definition, we ask our stakeholders, who are we sending our graduates to? Are they telling us what a mission quality graduate looks like? Okay, if we have that answer, now we can go we can go reverse engineer and say,
Yeah.
if that's the end, what's the kind of student we need to admit to our organization in order that we can have missional success?
It's great, Ralph. That's great. So we're not defining success solely by the number of students we have, or how large our faculty is, or the library, or things along those lines. It's really whether we are achieving the mission that we believe we have for the
Right.
institution. Yeah, good.
But everybody's going to think that we have prestige because we have all these benchmarks.
Yeah,
One of the things that one of my hobby horses about faculty is we equate credentials with qualifications.
right.
Credentials is not the same thing as qualifications. There are
Mm,
minimum credentials that you have to have if you're going to be a post-secondary
sure.
institution, but the higher the credential doesn't mean the higher the qualification. Those are two different things.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, we have time for maybe one more.
I
Simon, you
see
have your
one
hand
hand.
up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Simon. Yeah.
Hello, Ralph. Thank you very much. Simon
Hi,
from
Simon.
Kontal.
Tell me where you're from.
From Kontal, CIU Kontal,
Oh, Clontal,
Germany.
my man. I'm
Yeah,
just getting ready to start teaching a course week after
right.
next.
Yeah,
Yeah.
looking forward to that. Ralph, a quick question. The kind of people you described you wish to have on your board, those who bring wisdom and have connection to wealth and so on, they're usually very busy people.
Yeah.
So how do you convince them that they should be on your board and also not just to sit on a chair there, but to actively be engaged in the work of the board?
Well,
Yeah, it's
that's a
challenging.
that's a great question there. Yeah.
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 The thing is that I find that people respond to high expectations. So if you say what the expectations are, then even busy people, if you define what your expectations are, they'll respond to them. So I'm not, that sounds idealistic, but that's been my experience. I think you can get high caliber people if you make it clear what it is you're asking them to do. And then if the board meetings themselves are engaging not just with trivial matters, they're really engaging with leadership issues. I find that board members that are really high caliber, strategic thinkers, they come to a lot of organizational boards and they say, this is a waste of time. We just spent an hour talking about something that is so trivial. I don't want to waste my time doing this. So I think there's a board culture that you have to build that's dealing with strategic and generative kinds of things with the ends issues. And then you get high level people. I'm not saying you'll always be successful in board recruitment. You won't. But I think you can be if you have high expectations and you build a culture of it. And then peer pressure helps. You get a couple board members that are really committed and high level people, they tend to attract others.
Ralph, we'll try to get one more question in here from the chat. The question is, Ralph, you mentioned earlier about being an agent of change for a dysfunctional board that took 10 years to turn around. Any advice on who a board should engage if a major change needs to be implemented? Is it always advisable to have a third party, or can a board manage such a transition internally?
Yeah, and in the case that I mentioned, it happened internally because somebody came onto the board with that expertise. And there were several of us on the board that began to get the vision for something better. Um, and so that board, in and of itself, over time, developed the disciplines that I talked about today, developed the vocabulary. I can remember meeting after meeting, we would sit there and look at the agenda and say, is this a means issue or an ends issue?
Yeah.
Do we have a policy about this? Why don't we have a policy? Why are we talking about this for the third time? Why don't we make a policy? And that, so it can happen internally. Um, Obviously, if you don't have that resource internally, somebody who's a facilitator might help you. And training is key. The
Yeah.
best boards are ones that keep getting better. They're committed to ongoing improvement.
It's great, Ralph. Ralph, thank you again for your time. This has been so informative and helpful, and great questions and interaction with the group here today. And sincerely, thank you for doing this for us. I know that it's almost just the beginning. There's so much more that we can talk about,
Yeah.
and
You
I
could
know that you've
unpack every one of those things
exactly,
infinitely. Yeah.
and I know that you've been a great help to us, ISET, and our board, and I even learned some more things here just listening to you today. So thank you again. And I'm going to turn it over to Julie with she has some closing comments and other things, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Ralph and Michael, for such a great time today. Just one little announcement that we have regarding our ISET virtual next month, which will still be on the third Friday of the month, May 15th. We will be having that, and the topic for next month is on generations. So we'll be looking at what does it look like for those in both the senior leaders and the next generation, and them coming up within theological education. So we're grateful that you all joined us today, and that we hope that you will join us again next month for our ISET virtual. May the Lord bless you.